Subscribe if this truth makes your skin crawl. Like, drop a comment with the moment you held your breath, and hit the bell because the next case is worse. They reached the farmhouse at the edge of Plainfield after dark, headlights cutting through a November flurry that fell like ashes. The house didn't belong to a villain from the movies. It belonged to a quiet man people barely noticed, the kind who fixed neighbors' fences and bought kerosene without haggling. But that night the door was locked, the windows black, and the sheriff's men stood in the yard listening to the wind grind across the frozen fields. A woman from the hardware store had not come home. Her last receipt, the last signature, led here. The deputy tested the back door with his shoulder. It groaned, then held. They circled to the shed, to the lean-to, to the barn whose seam let out a cold, sour draft. No one spoke because something unspoken was already standing among them. A man fetched a crowbar. Another tugged his scarf higher, the wool rough against his lip where the windburn had split it. The crowbar bit, the hinge shrieked, and the barn door swung open on a dark that felt heavier than air. Inside, the smell hit them first, old iron, damp earth, something they couldn't name but instinctively recoiled from. The deputy lifted his flashlight and the beam made a white column through dust. The mouth goes dry, the mind refuses the shapes. They didn't shout. They didn't speak. In silence they registered that the world had quietly shifted off its axis. The suspect wasn't there. The suspect, whose name the town said softly in grocery aisles, wasn't anywhere on the property. In the house the coal stove was cold. A blue enamel cup sat upside down on the counter, a cookie tin sealed with kitchen twine on the shelf. Wallpaper peeled in a corner, revealing an older layer of flowers under newer flowers. Everywhere, an attempt at normal life, and yet beneath it, a drip of dread the way spring meltwater finds a seam in a wall. They brought up lanterns. A state investigator, the newest in the room, tried to measure his breath so it wouldn't fog his notebook. He had been told this was simply a welfare check that might convert into a search. He'd done those before. He understood routine. He understood doors. He did not understand the weight of this silence, this domestic hush that had learned how to swallow its own sounds. On the kitchen table lay a Bible, a pencil tucked 3/4 in. Beside it, a stack of yellowed clippings about disappearances 2 counties over. Nothing sensational, just columns of text, small as seeds. In the living room, a chair angled toward a dead radio, the fabric rubbed smooth on one arm where a hand had rested night after night. The deputy crouched, pressing a gloved finger to the floorboards. "Fresh scuff," he said, voice low. Something heavy moved. Recent. They found the pantry door stuck, not locked. When it gave, a draft from deeper inside brushed their faces and raised the hair along their necks. The investigator's light fell on a row of jars on a high shelf. Preserves, peaches maybe, and something else the color of weak tea. A string hung from a nail with nothing tied to it, the cut end frayed. He noted the fray, the empty string, because detail is the only way to keep fear at arm's length. Outside, the radio in the cruiser crackled with a voice from town. The hardware store ledger, the time of the last sale, the suspect's name on the line, the date and hour. The sheriff's reply came flat: "Copy." He turned his face toward the window pane and saw his reflection staring back like a stranger. The suspect's neighbors described him as simple, odd, but helpful. He took odd jobs. He kept to himself. He'd been seen at the county dump collecting things that no one else would take. He wore the same cap every day. He stared too long at women in church, though never with a smile. Most men like this passed through life without leaving a mark. Most. The investigator recorded that caveat in his mind and kept moving. On a dresser in a spare room, a photograph in a cracked frame showed a severe woman in a high-collared dress, the edges of her mouth flattened into a hard line. A mother who believed the world outside her door was sin, and that a son could be safeguarded if her rules were iron. The sheriff touched the frame with his glove and set it down carefully, as if apologizing for seeing it. Behind the dresser, a faint ring on the floor suggested it had once sat somewhere else. They lifted it, searching for a seam in the wall. There was no secret passage there. But there was a trunk at the foot of the bed, leather dried and crazed. Inside were quilts folded tight, the kind you pass down, the kind that retain the scent of winters and wood smoke. Tucked beneath them, a scrapbook of obituaries, clippings meticulously trimmed and pasted in neat rows. An index of vanishing. One deputy excused himself and stepped onto the back stoop to breathe air that did not come from inside that house. The field stretched white and empty to the tree line, a flat, unblinking gaze from the land itself. He found boot tracks mottled into ice, some old, some not. They led to the pump, then across to the smokehouse. When he touched its door, he felt the grain of the wood through his glove, rough as a rasp. He thought of meat hung in summer, of winter sausage, of ordinary rural life. He did not want to open it. He opened it anyway. Back in the kitchen, the investigator discovered a ledger of purchases written in a careful hand. Nails, oil, salt, a length of rope. The rope line had a check mark beside it. The current day's date appeared on the last page. His pen paused there, registering the neatness of the mark. He thought of the woman from the hardware store. He thought of her son waiting for her to come home. He pushed the thought away and kept to procedure because letting anything in would be like pulling a thread. The whole sweater would come apart. The sheriff returned from the outbuildings and closed the door gently behind him. He didn't report what he'd seen, not yet. He asked for the basement key. No one had found it. The basement door had no keyhole on the kitchen side at all, only a metal slide, the kind you use to keep raccoons out of corn. Someone had chosen that latch. Someone had chosen to keep the barrier simple and sure, accessible from both sides if your hands knew what to feel for in the dark. They slid it back. The door grumbled on its hinges as if clearing its throat to speak, then fell silent. A smell rose up that had lingered in the wood for years, turned the grain of the stairs itself into a wick for it. The investigator swallowed, tasting his own heartbeat, and lowered his light. A single pull string hung from the ceiling, tied into a neat loop at the end. It trembled slightly in a draft none of them could feel. He thought of the town again, how tomorrow women would gather at the post office, men would stand on the bar's front step with sacks of seed and say, "We never would have guessed." He thought of the way horror looks ordinary up close. The chipped plate, the folded towel, the bed made with corners tucked sharp. That ordinariness is the most frightening mask of all, because it lets a monster move through the daylight without anyone moving aside. The first stair complained as his weight came down on it. The men behind him shifted, the beam of one light jittering across peeling paint. Flies slept in the corners and did not stir. Far away, a dog barked once and then stopped. They were very much alone. "Down we go," the sheriff said softly, not to be brave but to say something human that could be measured and written down. They took the steps one by one. The floor below was packed earth. A workbench stood against a wall. Something lay under burlap. Something else hung from a beam, swaying by some invisible current. The investigator kept his light tight, left to right, not letting it wander because he knew that once you allow your eye to drift, it will latch onto something you can't unsee. He focused on what could be unambiguous: tools, jars, twine, a calendar pinned to a stud with a nail driven crooked. Dates circled. The same month and day resurfaced year after year, like a remembered ritual. The dates lined up with headlines in the scrapbook upstairs. His throat closed. He coughed to force it open. It was not the house of a movie. It was the house of a man who had built a second world under his first, piece by piece, until the lower one started to seep through the seams. An investigator thinks of motives the way a doctor thinks of symptoms. Loneliness, fixation, devotion twisted into something else. A son shaped by a mother's iron hand, who believed that the earth itself needed to be corrected by his own crude scalpel of faith and fantasy. They paused in front of the workbench. The burlap was stained with something dark that had faded into the cloth over years of seasons. The sheriff touched a corner with two gloved fingers and lifted. Beneath it lay a set of items no one would ever mistake for tools, not if they allowed themselves to understand what they were looking at. The investigator found that his knees had locked. He told them to bend. They didn't. And there, on a shelf above the bench, was the thing that made the room tilt. An artifact that, in another life, would have been a curiosity in a museum of the frontier, handmade, resourceful, grotesquely creative. Here it said something simple and terrible. Someone had practiced. Someone had refined. Someone had planned for a future. He set the burlap back down, the fabric whispering as it settled, and he understood that the house would not be done surprising them. There were other rooms, other trunks, other doors. Outside, frost was forming on the cruiser's windshield. Morning was coming, and with morning the press, the neighbors, the town that would never again say the suspect's name without closing its throat around it like a stone. The deputy looked to the far wall where a second door stood half swallowed by shadow. Not the kitchen door. Not the pantry. A door no one had noticed at first because it was painted the same dull color as the wall and because the mind protects itself by erasing what it cannot bear. The investigator aimed his light at the seam. The paint there was less dusty as if touched more often. A key, an old skeleton key, was set on a nail above it, its teeth polished by years of familiar fingers. He lifted it down, and the metal felt warm from the house's breath, though the house had no heat. They stood before that door, the sheriff, the deputy, the investigator, each of them understanding that what they had already seen had crossed a line. and that this door stood on the far side of another they had not yet crossed. He slid the key into the lock. It turned with a click that sounded larger than it was, and the door eased outward like something exhaling after being held too long. What waited behind that door wasn't a rumor, or a movie, or a scene you could cut away from. It was the reason a quiet town would never speak of winter the same way again. It was the answer to the ledger's check mark, the missing woman, the empty string. And when they opened the locked basement door fully, the thing they found buried in that room changed everything. They didn't shout when the door eased open. Nobody said the obvious words. The room beyond was narrow and low, the joists so close you could feel them pressing down on your scalp. It had the careful order of a workshop and the wrongness of a dream. On the nearest wall, hooks held objects that had started life as ordinary things and been urged into shapes they were never meant to be. The workbench beneath them bore the marks of long labor. Knife scores, circles where jars had sat, a soft depression where hands had rested for years. The air tasted metallic like biting a coin. The investigator kept his light moving, left to right, cataloging. A ledger lay open on a small table, its edges scalloped by use, its columns filled with tiny, perfect numbers. Each line matched the calendar on the stud outside. Same dates, same rhythm, a pulse that had guided a life quietly along the edge of what the town called normal. Beside the ledger, a stack of clipped articles was held under a rock the size of a fist. Headlines told the story in hospital-clean language. Missing, last seen, no leads. While the margins were filled with notes in a patient hand, the kind used to balance a checkbook or copy scripture. The sheriff made a small noise and tilted his light toward a shelf. There, arranged with ceremony, sat objects fashioned from what should never have been used for craft. The investigator felt the same sensation as on the porch, the world slipping, the floor dropping a fraction of an inch. He tightened his jaw until it clicked and wrote a single word in his notebook: assemblages. He did not look again. On the far wall a curtain of burlap hung from a wire. The sheriff breathed once, steady, and slid it back. The space beyond wasn't large. It was a staging of sorts, a place where someone had practiced how to make a private vision real. On a chair was a dress, old-fashioned and carefully mended. On a shelf, a row of pill bottles empty of pills but full of tiny keepsakes whose meanings were known only to their collector. A photograph had been tacked to the wall. The same severe woman from the bedroom, her eyes sharp as tacks, her mouth a rule. The investigator wrote, "Mother." The deputy swallowed and spoke for the first time since they'd gone below. "This ain't a crime scene, Sheriff," he said softly. "It's a church." They were not the first to think it. The suspect had made an altar out of loneliness, a ritual out of absence. Up close, the effort looked less like evil and more like desperate devotion warped into something that could not be contained by the shape of ordinary life. The mother had taught him the world was wicked, so he had made a smaller world where he could be both priest and parishioner, penitent and absolved. A sound ticked in the silence. The investigator swung his beam to a shelf where an alarm clock lay face down. The hands were stopped at 1:14. Dust furred the glass but not the button that set the alarm. Polished by a thumb. Used often. He charted time in here. He came and went by a bell no one else could hear. "What about the woman?" the sheriff asked, voice almost conversational, as if they stood in a kitchen deciding whether to put a pot on. "We have to find her first." They found something else. In a corner, a wooden crate had been padded with quilts. Not for comfort, more like a buffer against bruising. Rope lay coiled at the bottom like a sleeping snake. It was clean. That was almost worse than if it had been stained. Above the crate, a nail bore a tag carded from the hardware store, the kind with a price printed on it. The number matched the ledger's last entry. The investigator's throat closed again. He forced air through it. The sheriff looked toward the stairs. "We'll get a warrant signed for the whole property," he said. "We do this by the book. And we find him." By dawn, snow had stopped and the sky over the fields had turned the color of skim milk. The state boys arrived, their tires cutting gray slashes in the white. The yard filled with people who moved with the choreography of habit, cordon, photo, bag, tag, talking in low voices to keep from raising what lay under the ground. In town, the diner filled with rumors and empty coffee cups. The radio said the suspect's full name now, and each time a voice said it, a hush seemed to follow like a skim of ice over water. They didn't find him at the farm. They found his footprints ending at the road where someone had offered him a ride not knowing what they were delivering to the world. They found a receipt for gasoline in his coat pocket when they finally stopped him walking along the highway, the winter sun on his face as if this were any other morning. He didn't run. He looked almost relieved to see the cars pull onto the shoulder, their doors open. men stepping out into the bright cold with their hands already in their minds rehearsing how to keep steady. At the station, he sat with his cap in his hands and watched dust swim in a bar of light. He answered in monosyllables, then in full sentences when questions were reshaped into the simple words he understood. Yes, no, what? A long time ago. The words came like stones set carefully into a path. He spoke of his mother with reverence, of the way the town had rotted when she left him alone with it. He spoke about the field at night, how the wind made the corn whisper like voices you could almost hear. He spoke as if he were the victim and the world had done this to him. Back at the farmhouse, the team worked room by room. The upstairs bedroom at the front of the house had been sealed with a board across the door and newspaper pasted over the seams. Once they pried it open, they found dust and drifts and a bed made with hospital precision, the pillowcase creased, the braided rug shaken and rolled and left in a corner like it would be unfurled again when the right feet returned. A bottle of perfume sat on the dresser half full, though it must have evaporated by now. Even grief obeys evaporation. The sheriff did not step inside. He stood in the doorway as if visiting a grave. Then evidence began to move like the suspect's stories, sideways. The crate in the basement had a twin in the smokehouse that had not been there the night before. A tagged item from the workshop appeared on the pantry shelf without a tag. A bagged scrap turned up on the kitchen table with a different number. An out-of-towner suggested bureaucratic error. A local deputy went red and cold at once. The investigator looked from face to face and saw the problem in the eyes they didn't meet. In a small place, the suspect didn't live alone. He lived inside people's favors, the debts they owed to his late mother, the times he'd fixed a fence, the gossip he hadn't spread. Someone in uniform wanted this smaller, cleaner, easier to endure. Someone wanted to tuck sin back under the rug where it had slept for decades. The sheriff collected everyone in the yard. His voice was level and low and allowed no room for shame to hide behind its usual jokes. "Touch nothing that isn't assigned to you," he said. "If you moved it, say it. If you saw it moved, say that too." The only man who spoke was the oldest deputy, who taught Little League and kept the flag out front of the jail from dragging on the dirt. "I put the crate on the porch," he said, hands and fists at his sides. There was a thaw dripping through the smokehouse roof. It was going to wet the evidence. He had not meant harm. Harm did not care. They pushed on. In the barn, behind a stack of feed sacks, the investigator found a map of the county hand-drawn on butcher paper. Penciled excess dotted creek beds, fence corners, culverts on the new highway, edges of the cemetery where the headstones leaned like old teeth. Some excess had dates. The dates matched the calendar again. He felt the invisible clockwork spin in his mind. The suspect had been patient for years. Patience can be a kind of violence if it waits for a thing no human heart can hold. Back at the station, the suspect asked for a sandwich. He folded the napkin into a triangle and then again into a smaller triangle while the recorder ticked softly on the table. A state man slid a photograph of the hardware store owner across to him. "Where is she?" he asked. The suspect pressed 2 fingers to the picture's edge like he could keep it from sliding further away. "Not in the house," he said. It wasn't a denial. It was a direction. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of tin. There was a state of mind that matched it perfectly, and the investigator found he now lived there. He stood on the farmhouse porch and looked at the fields, empty and endless, and pictured each X on the map lighting up like a match in the dark. The team could dig for a year and not unearth every secret. The truth was big enough to cast a shadow on the decades to come. Inside, a young deputy, new badge, steady hands, called down from the stairwell. "You need to see this." The investigator climbed, his knees finally remembering how to bend. The deputy had found a hidden panel behind the photograph of the mother in the spare room. The cavity was shallow, the kind of space you keep letters in. Inside lay a book bound in black. It was not a ledger. It was a diary. The script was neat, the entries almost daily at first, then weekly, then only on special days, the ones circled on the calendars. Thoughts of sin and purity, of women who laughed too loud, of men who drank and lied and took up pews their souls hadn't earned. The mother's voice bled through the son's hand, then disappeared as the son's voice finally took over. The last entry was brief. "Tonight I will put things back in order. I will make a home the way a home should be." The sheriff read it over the investigator's shoulder, his breath slow. "What night?" he asked. The investigator turned back a page. The date in the corner matched the day the hardware store owner vanished. He didn't realize his hand had closed into a fist until his pen cracked. A radio popped downstairs. Static, a voice, another voice cutting in quick. Someone at the station had checked the ride the suspect took that morning against calls for assistance. At 5:30 a.m., a Good Samaritan had picked up a man on County G and dropped him near the old quarry road. The quarry road led to a culvert the suspect had marked on his map with an X and a small arrow the investigator had mistaken for a smudge. They split into two teams. The sheriff went for the quarry with the older deputy and a handful of state men. The investigator stayed back with the youngest deputy to sweep the house once more in case they'd missed a weakness in the suspect's bland, stubborn lies, some hint that would make the math change. The house creaked in the cold and settled around them like a great animal finding a more comfortable shape. They found the weakness by accident. In the kitchen, the youngest deputy tapped the underside of a shelf with a knuckle and got a hollow sound. He pried at a loose board and a narrow space revealed itself like a secret held too long. Inside was a cigar tin, the kind the old men at the bar flipped open and shut between stories. Inside the tin, a key. The deputy lifted it into his palm. It was smooth with handling. Not the basement key, they had that. Not the spare room key, it had been nailed above the hidden door. It was older, stained, the teeth oddly cut. The investigator's mind jumped the way a needle skips to a remembered part of a song. The map. The quarry. The culvert. Some of the cemetery excess had little dots beside them. Not all. Just the ones at the oldest part of the graveyard where the ground had moved the most under years of freeze and thaw. A sound came from the back porch then, a soft metallic tap, like a latch setting itself after being jarred. The deputy went still, the key a cold moon in his palm. The investigator raised a hand and tilted his head. Footsteps? No. The house breathing? No. The animal perimeter of fear edged closer, testing the fence. He moved to the mudroom, the place where boots came off and coats went on, and looked at the door's slide latch. It was open. He could have sworn he'd set it himself when they entered. He closed it, slowly listening for the whisper of metal. It whispered, then gave a small, traitorous jingle as the loop on the latch trembled. A shadow crossed the snow just beyond the frosted glass, a smudge then a shape then nothing. The investigator cut the light, and the kitchen fell into the blue light of winter afternoon. He could see his breath now. He could see the places he had touched, the faint smears on the cupboard where his glove had brushed too hard. He could hear the thump of his own blood in his ear. The back porch step creaked, the particular sound of wood under a single careful foot. The deputy sucked in air and choked it back down, eyes wide, key clenched. The investigator eased the kitchen drawer open with 2 fingers and found what he hoped for. A long screwdriver, heavy in the hand, the kind a farm boy keeps sharpened on a wheel for reasons that make sense until they don't. A voice came through the door, soft and almost polite. Left something behind. Not a shout. Not a threat. The cadence of a man returning to a neighbor's stoop for a forgotten hat. The investigator's grip tightened until the screwdriver's handle bit his palm. He could feel the grain of the wood through his glove. "Then you can tell us what it is," he said, and his voice sounded like someone else's. Low, even the way you talk to a wild animal you hope won't bolt or charge. The latch jiggled again, a small experiment from the other side. The deputy took half a step back, then forward again, the war in him ending with resolve. The door's frame shuddered as a shoulder leaned against it. The frosted pane showed a blot. No face, not quite, not anything you could use later to describe a person in a courtroom, just a darkness where a human head must be. Beyond that, across the fields, sirens began to rise and swirl toward the quarry as the other team closed in. The house held its second breath. The latch dropped of its own weight, metal on metal, a sound like a coin flipping in a church collection plate. The investigator looked at the deputy and at the key winking in his hand, and he understood in one bright, cutting instant that this was not over, in the quarry or in the house. The suspect had left more than artifacts and ledgers and diagrams of the past. He had left a plan for the present. The knob turned, the door eased inward an inch, and the man on the other side, whether he was the one they'd been hunting or someone who wished them clean of this mess, said in that same flat kindness, "You boys missed a room." The door stopped halfway open. Cold air rushed in, bringing the scent of soil and gasoline. The man on the threshold was smaller than the myths that had already started forming about him. His cap sat low, his coat hung loose, and his eyes held the dull calm of someone who'd been living with his own ghosts so long they'd become polite company. The deputy froze, still clutching the key they'd found in the cigar tin. The investigator stepped forward just enough to block his line of sight to the rest of the room. The man smiled faintly, not mockery, not friendliness, just an automatic expression from a life lived trying to appear normal. "You shouldn't be here," the investigator said. The man tipped his head. "Neither should you." Behind him, the snowflakes drifted sideways under a weak wind. For a heartbeat it seemed as though the whole world had paused to listen. Then the sheriff's voice cracked through the radio at the investigator's belt. "We've got something at the quarry. It's her." The suspect's eyes twitched toward the sound, and in that flicker of motion the mask slipped. For the first time the investigator saw something alive in him, a private flash of triumph or maybe relief that someone had finally found the thing he couldn't finish burying. The deputy lunged and the man didn't resist. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, and he looked down at them with mild curiosity, as though admiring some fine workmanship. "She's at rest now," he said softly. "They never rest until they're whole again." The words didn't make sense until the investigator remembered the map, the excess, the dots, the pattern that wasn't just graves but attempts to assemble something missing from his mother's world. He realized that what they'd found at the farm was only half the design. The rest was scattered through the soil of Wisconsin, each piece marked by those quiet excess. By the next morning, the farm had become a storm of flashbulbs and tire tracks. Reporters stood where only hours earlier silence had ruled, their microphones pointed toward the door like weapons against the dark. Inside, technicians worked under bright portable lamps, cataloging every nail, every scrap of paper, every jar of forgotten experiments. The sheriff walked the investigator through the house one last time. The rooms were smaller now, emptied of mystery but not of dread. "They'll tear it down," he said. "No one will want to live this close to what happened." The investigator nodded but kept his eyes on the wallpaper, layer over layer of flowers, each new pattern trying to hide the old. "You think he was done?" he asked. The sheriff didn't answer. He didn't have to. At the county jail, the suspect sat in a small room under humming lights. He had been fed, washed, and given a fresh set of clothes, but the smell of earth and rust clung to him like a second skin. A psychologist sat across from him, taking notes while the camera on the ceiling blinked red. "Why the women?" she asked. He smiled again, that same mild curve of the mouth. "Mother said they were wicked," he said. "I just made them pure again." "How?" "By fixing them." He said it simply, like describing a chore done right. The psychologist glanced at the two men behind the glass. The investigator's jaw was tight. He'd heard confessions before, but this wasn't one. This was liturgy. "Where did you learn that?" she pressed. He looked up, his eyes narrowing like a child scolded for repeating an old prayer. "In the good book," he said. "And in her book. She wrote it all down." "You read it yet?" "The diary." The investigator's breath caught. They had turned it over to the evidence team, but they hadn't read beyond the last page. The suspect's tone made it sound less like a diary and more like a scripture. That night, after everyone had gone, the investigator opened the evidence locker and read. The diary began in the mother's voice, tight, judgmental, full of warnings about sin, women, and the world. Then the handwriting changed. It was the son's hand, mimicking hers at first, then diverging into a crude scrawl that pulsed with desperation. One passage stopped him cold. "She told me she'd come back when the house was ready. I keep it clean. I build what's missing. She'll walk again when the pieces are all in their places." It wasn't madness that guided him. It was devotion, an endless attempt to resurrect the only person he'd ever loved, by reconstructing the image she'd left behind. The investigator closed the book. In the hum of the evidence room, the fluorescent lights flickered, and for a moment the sound reminded him of the pull-string bulb in the basement. A week later, demolition crews arrived at the farmhouse. The sheriff, the investigator, and a handful of deputies stood back as the first wall came down. Dust billowed into the cold morning air. Beneath the boards they found one last hidden space, a crawl cavity behind the pantry. Inside it was a small box carved from pine and sealed with wax. The sheriff pried it open carefully. Inside lay a collection of newspaper clippings, all with women's faces cut out. The spaces where their eyes had been were replaced with small mirror shards. On the lid, etched in a child's trembling hand, was a phrase burned into the wood. "Mother sees everything." The investigator's stomach turned. He looked toward the treeline, where frost still clung to the branches like spider silk. Somewhere beyond that, normal life continued. Children walking to school, trucks hauling feed, radios playing love songs. The contrast made the air feel thinner. He turned back to the sheriff. "Burn it all," he said quietly. "Don't let this place breathe again." But horror doesn't end when the house falls. It migrates. A year later, in 1958, Hollywood came calling. They changed the names, exaggerated the details, made it something people could watch from the safety of a theater. They called it the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Audiences screamed, gasped, and went home to sleep in warm beds. What they didn't know was that much of what they saw was not invention, it was translation. The farmhouse, the trophies, the devotion turned obsession, the blurred line between love and blasphemy, it was all there, buried under snow and silence long before the cameras ever rolled. The investigator read about the film's success in the papers and turned the page without finishing the article. He had seen the real thing. Pretend horror couldn't touch him anymore. That winter he received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a metal key, identical to the one they'd found in the cigar tin, tied with a piece of frayed string. No note. No explanation. Just the key and the smell of old wood faintly clinging to it. He held it for a long time, feeling its cold weight. The farmhouse was gone. The suspect was in a hospital, babbling prayers to a mother who never returned. Yet somehow, something had found its way back into his hands. He placed the key in an envelope, sealed it, and dropped it into the river. The current took it without hesitation, carrying it toward the dark line of trees. As he watched it vanish, he whispered the only truth he'd learned from the whole case. Evil doesn't die. It just changes houses. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe, because the next real case might be hiding closer than you think.